Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic presentation and recording for the part of the lesson that has us looking at the rise of the Renaissance in Europe. Before we get started, please let me encourage you to open up to today's lesson, scroll down the correct section, and get ready to fill in the blanks that correspond to the presentation, and of course the blank parts in your notes. Please remember to also answer any key concept questions that happen to appear throughout the notes section and after. Please also remember that you can play any part of this presentation for detailed clarity or repetition later on. Let's go ahead and get started. This is the story of the rise of the Renaissance. Consider this question. What was the Renaissance, and what factors led to the rise of the Renaissance in Europe, and what impacts did it have on the world? So basically, Western Europe emerged from the Middle Ages during the era known as the Renaissance. But what does that word actually mean? Well, from 1300 to 1600, Western Europe experienced a rebirth in trade, art, learning, and a return of Greco-Roman ideas. The word Renaissance actually means rebirth. Now, during the Renaissance, Europeans developed new ideas in art, government, and human potential. What's really interesting about this is that, of course, you wouldn't expect some of these achievements to reappear after what Europe went through in the Dark Ages. However, many scholars, merchants, and bankers spread Renaissance ideas across Europe. And in 1450, Gutenberg's printing press allows books to be made quickly, which helped with the transfusion of ideas across Europe too. Of course, French and Spanish invaded and then spread Italian culture when they returned home. Now, the Renaissance marked the beginning of the modern era, for what we call it in world history. But what changed during the Middle Ages that gave rise to the Renaissance specifically? Well, the following few factors give us some indications as to how and why a rebirth in Europe might have been the case, with trade in cities, government, religion, and human potential. Let's talk about trade in cities here first. What was trade like during the Middle Ages? Well, to go back to the previous lesson, things by the Renaissance in comparison to the Middle Ages were pretty much times 10. For example, a side effect of the Crusades that we talked about previously was the increase of European demand for luxury goods from Asia. In many ways, the luxury goods changed the very fabric of the life of the Europeans. Additionally, as people came in contact with one another, so too did cultural diffusion spread throughout Europe. Italian merchants began meeting the demand for trade in Europe, and additionally, as a result, Italian cities and a wealthy middle class began to form in Italy. This middle class is largely responsible for the consumer culture that would be associated with the Renaissance. Additionally, the most important Italian city was Florence, where vast wealth from trade sparked the Renaissance. Many prominent families, of course, rose during this era too. Additionally, a new middle class of bankers, merchants, and skilled craftsmen gained lots and lots of power in Europe. For example, the Medici family were wealthy bankers who used their wealth to turn Florence into Italy's most artistic and beautiful city. Now let's go ahead and talk about government. What was government like in the Middle Ages? Well, if you can recall the feudal structure that defines medieval Europe, compared to that of the Renaissance, you'll see some stark differences. For example, kings and queens and rulership and leadership would change. Kings were able to tax merchants and gain much wealth. Kings also used their wealth to build armies and strong nations, and the art of nation building later took hold of Europe. This, however, hurt the power of the feudal lords, and power went back to being concentrated around the kings and not shared with the numerous lords, so therefore feudalism declined. Now, additionally, in other parts of Europe, like for example from 1337 to 1453, England and France began a series of conflicts over territory that would be called the 100 Years' War. As depicted here by this map, many major battles would rock this part of Western Europe. Now, during the war, nationalism, or loyalty to one's nation, increased as people became more loyal to their king and nation rather than their local lords. Of course, France and England would fight for a number of years, and stop fighting for a time, but then break the uneasy peace treaties and then fight again. The 100 Years' War was in many ways marked by big violence that lasted for many, many years. Historians and people, of course, who provide first-hand accounts of the 100 Years' War note just the gore and additionally the atrocities committed during this war. Now, this cycle of fighting a brief time of peace and then fighting again would continue between England and France not only for over 100 years, of course hence the name, but also have huge ramifications on the makeup and dynamics of Europe for a long time to come. You see, the most legendary figure from the 100 Years' War was Joan of Arc, a French peasant girl. Claiming that God told her to do so in a vision, Joan became a soldier and led the French to numerous victories over the English. Now, additionally, at age 19, she was captured and executed and being burned at the stake. Joan of Arc not only became a legend, but also a saint in the Roman Catholic Church too. As you're aware, Christianity and medieval advancements and achievements, and warfare and military might go hand in hand in many parts of European history. During the 100 Years' War, a new military weapon decreased the power of feudal lords and knights too. Of course, we're talking about the Europeans' discovery of the Chinese gunpowder, which led to the development of cannons, which helped armies penetrate the walls of castles. Therefore, the once mighty fortifications that stood tall and mighty became very much so prone to attack. Another new weapon was the longbow, which allowed soldiers to shoot accurately up to 300 yards. As alluded to in the last lesson, medieval technology becomes further advanced as well in warfare. The longbow as depicted here was pretty much the size of the shooter itself, and would of course be able to travel, the arrow anyway, for many, many yards. Additionally, these new weapons and new tactics, like using lightly armored mounted troops, effectively ended the importance of knights as a military force. Now let's go ahead and talk about religion. Religion in world cultures and world history is a complex subject, but it's key to understanding the Renaissance and its many influences. If you can recall what religion was like in the Middle Ages, while still in its early stages with Christianity coming up off the heels of the fall of the Roman Empire, during the Renaissance, Christianity would receive a new rebirth too. In the late Middle Ages, the Pope and the Catholic Church instigated a series of holy wars called the Crusades to drive the Muslims out of the Holy Land. This map here depicts the Crusades, from 1096 to 1204. Additionally, the Crusades were a failure and resulted in the decreasing power and influence of the Catholic Church, so these failed holy wars also helped end the feudal system as we once knew it. Not only that, despite having less influence, the Catholic Church still remained an important part of people's lives, and the popes remained important religious and political leaders in society, and also, of course, within the Church. Now let's go ahead and talk about human potential. What was expected of people during the Middle Ages, during the feudal era, versus what was expected of people during the Renaissance? Of course, the stark differences are night and day. During the Middle Ages, peasants did not own land and had no options for their lives other than remaining loyal to the feudal lord and working within the manorial system. As depicted here, the manorial system offered, of course, some protection for people who toiled and tilled the land for their landlords and were protected by knights. However, the rise of trade during the Renaissance gave people options to actually make money and pursue different lives, so that they did do. Peasants could now leave the manor and move to cities to work as merchants or skilled artisans. Another reason for the decline of the manorial system was the spread of the plague, also known as the Black Death. As alluded to before in the Asia unit, the Black Death or the Black Plague would have huge ramifications for much of the world. As depicted here, buboes would appear on the skin and essentially spread, having also further complications on the inside parts of a person's internal anatomy. Now, of course, it's no surprise to us now, knowing what we know, how and why the bubonic plague spread. Fleas, of course, when they would vomit, essentially would release the influenza. And of course, in many ways, the fleas often hitched rides on rats. In 1347, a trade ship arrived in Italy from Asia. In addition to Asian goods, the ship was carrying rats infested with these plague-infected fleas that I referred to. Of course, the plague swept quickly throughout Europe along trade routes. And the Black Death itself was known to be, of course, a traumatic event for many Europeans. Of course, with densely packed cities, it was probably pretty tough for people to exist and simply persist. Tales of the Black Death and Black Plague show us just how hard it was to survive and thrive during this era. Bubonic plague would also have huge ramifications on how people would live. Although attempted cures for the plague were never actually found, many people dabbled in the art of care for the human anatomy. Through prayer, bathing in urine, isolation, even using leeches, placing dead animals in the home, pomanders, or perfumes, plague doctors soon became to feel defeated. The plague killed 25 million people in 5 years, one-third of Europe's population. And the plague caused a labor shortage, and those that survived could only demand higher wages and more rights. During the Renaissance, however, people had more options than ever before, which led to a belief that people can accomplish anything. Individuals became the center of attention during the Renaissance. And in many ways, this type of mindset and cultural shift shapes Renaissance art. Social status was based on wealth and ability, not birthright. A new way of thinking began during the Renaissance too, called humanism. And humanists studied the classical ideas of Greece and Rome and believed that education can make the world a better place. For example, the ideal man was well educated, cultured, could dance, write poetry, and play music. And in many ways, we get the phrase the Renaissance man from this era. The ideal woman should have the same qualities, although cultured and intelligent, as men, but should not seek fame or political power. In many ways, modesty is a part of the Renaissance ideal woman. Renaissance women were better educated, but had fewer rights than medieval women too. Now, as you guys can see, there are many stark differences between both the medieval era, during the Dark Ages, and of course the Renaissance era. But using, of course, these comparisons can help us understand just how the growth of Europe would come to be. Because of the Renaissance era, Europe would forever be changed in its ideas, culture, government, religion, and more. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck with completing the rest of the lesson.